Today's session will focus on using measures, controlling your costs, and managing innovation. If you have questions for Steve, you can either use Twitter and tag @OKQualityOne and use hashtag BestPracticesOK, or raise your hand. We'll have some time for Q&A towards the end of the session. Please join me in welcoming Steve Stone.
Okay, that seemed much shorter when I wrote that. It actually feels it's a little embarrassing to have someone introduce you like that because there's a lot of information there. But we're really proud of the work we've done and have a lot of great opportunities to work around the world. And so it's nice to be able to come home and do something here in Oklahoma City as well. So I appreciate Heather and the Oklahoma Quality Foundation for inviting us to be here today. Pardon me. So David Dodd at 1 o'clock talked about disaster preparedness. And I want to talk about another potential disaster. And that's really trying to understand what your customers need and want. And then beyond that, how do you run your business? How do you manage your business in a way that you can provide those needs and wants in a successful and cost-effective manner? Okay, so let me start out first by talking a little bit about who Origin is. I think it's important to introduce us in the sense that you should have a feel for kind of our background, the way we approach projects. Some of the information that I'll be presenting today is similar to what other consulting firms and other organizations participate in and provide. But we're an industrial engineering firm. We specialize in process engineering. We're also management consulting. And so our approaches and methodologies are a little bit different, even though some of the terminologies might feel the same to you. Some of the outcomes might be the same as well. So we've been in business since 1988. We're proud of that. We're a little over 25 years old. And what we've been doing in that time period is really working with a lot of large Fortune 500 companies. And we've been helping them develop cost reduction strategies, quality improvement programs, productivity improvement programs. We really look for ways to help them improve their bottom line through different methodologies and through different outcomes that they expect. Our mission, and I think it's kind of important to focus on a couple of key words here, and that is we look to provide realistic and measurable solutions that enable our clients to gain a competitive advantage in the global marketplace. And we think that's important to focus on, is that there really is a lot of great approaches and ways you can go after problems, but our approach is going to be realistic and are they going to be measurable? And those are very important. And those really fall in line with my talk today as well. When we start talking about how to measure things and how to understand if you're doing the right things. Okay, we have broad experience, and this is also important. So we're an industrial engineering firm, and one of the benefits of being industrial engineers and process engineers is that we can work in a lot of different industries. IE is the study, which IE is industrial engineering. That's really the study of people and how people interact within their systems. So there's people that work in all these different industries. So we have a lot of experience working in healthcare, and that includes diagnostics laboratories. We work in distribution, supply chain and logistics, manufacturing. We've done work in the energy sector, government. We do a lot of operations, customer service, front office type work. So there's a lot of different areas that we have experiences in. And what really becomes the benefit is that we learn best practices from those different industries, and we can share those best practices with our clients in other industries. A lot of the things that we've learned in logistics and distribution have been a great benefit for healthcare, for example. So what's our best practice that I'm going to share with you today? So we're going to talk a little bit about how we help organizations. And the theme will be in line with my title. I'm talking about how to really address customers' needs and wants. But this is really one of the approaches that we would take to that type of a project. Some of the advantages of part of it, we do have some advantages being a third party. We're unbiased. We don't have any preconceived ideas. When we go into an organization, we don't have close process ownership. We get to see issues and problems a little easier than the people that are too close to things. So there's an advantage to that. However, all the techniques that we're going to talk about today, these are things that can and really are being used by a lot of organizations internally. So there should be quite a few takeaways for you today that allow you to maybe look at things a little bit differently, use some tools, some different concepts that you should be able to go back and maybe even apply within your own organizations. So here's some examples of some of the clients we've worked with. And the real reason, other than bragging, to throw this slide up is to talk a little bit about all the different industries we've worked in. And on the slide, you might recognize some retail organizations, manufacturing, healthcare, hospital organizations, distribution companies. There's a lot of different organizations on there. But all these organizations really have one thing in common. What they're looking for is ways to maintain high levels of quality and customer satisfaction, but at a competitive cost. So when we approach a project, these are real similar goals that we're looking at, regardless of the industry, regardless of the customer that we're working with. If these goals are met, then what we'd expect to see is at least some level of business success, which is the bottom line that we're looking for. What about the objectives, though? So we discussed goals. But if we look at some of the typical objectives, and this is only a sample list, we could probably go down and find more specific ones per customer type. But most people are looking to improve performance, and that performance will probably be defined by what their organization is, whether it's a sales organization or a manufacturing organization. They want to improve productivity, raise or even maintain the service levels that they currently have. They want measurable quality. So quality was a goal, but once we start measuring quality, it can become an objective. Reducing costs, increasing sales, increasing revenue. But most of the organizations we work with, they struggle with these objectives. And there's some common reasons why these organizations might struggle. Accountability. Many organizations really struggle with holding individuals accountable. Are they holding those individuals accountable? And the accountability goals, are they in line with the corporation's, with the company's goals? That's an important piece as well. Communication, and this is a very high level, but it's very true. You can probably find examples of this in most companies in this room here that you work with. Do they facilitate good communication between different levels and functions within the organization? Communication breakdowns can lead to a lot of problems. And perspective. This is very broad, but I think this really hits the nail on the head for what we're trying to accomplish today in my presentation. Can an organization maintain the big picture view of the business, as well as understanding who their customer is and understanding the business environment? So losing sight of that perspective. These are things, actually all three of these are things that happen as companies grow. And typically the organizations we work with are companies that are in growing periods, and I think that's been kind of a common theme of a few presentations today. That the previous presentation by Richard, they were forced to look at different things because of their growth. And that's really kind of a common theme that you'll see with the organizations we work with as well. Okay, so thoughts moving forward. So certainly we want good results, but management by results is not the way to get good results. You really have to work on the causes of those results. And that was said by Deming, which I think should be a familiar name to most everyone in here. He's kind of the father of continuous improvement. So I'll have several quotes throughout the day, and besides the fact that I kind of like to fill up my slides and talk about what other people say, these are here very strategically. There are specific messages within these quotes that are going to tie right back into kind of the lessons that I'm going to share with you. So there's some good stuff in here, especially with that last line, working on the cause of results. Okay, so let's talk about quality. We're going to transition from results to quality, and so quality is a result of what goes on in your organization. And the quality is the result that the customer sees from your organization. So if you look at quality, we want to say that it's defined by the customer's expectations. I think most people probably understand that. Most people probably don't feel like they kind of revelation. But can you really break down and understand what that expectation is? And then relate to the fact that, okay, understanding the customer ties directly back to quality. And that's what we're going to do today through some exercises. When you talk about quality, keep in mind this is products and services, at least from my perspective. So it can be any kind of a customer touch point is really a quality point. It doesn't have to be a durable good. It can be any time you interact with a customer. This also includes your internal customers. So some of the problem solving and mapping things that we'll look at today, keep in mind that this works for internal customers just as well. If you're servicing your internal customer well, then the organization is going to be more successful. If you have an internal failure, you probably have a failure at the end result that the external customer might experience. And then quality. It's very important that we build quality into our processes. So let's look at that. So my last statement was building quality into our processes. So if quality is an endpoint and the processes drive the quality, then how do we get there? So we have quality as an endpoint here, and this is a process map that I'm going to present to you today. This is kind of my roadmap for how to get to quality. In this pathway here, each one of these elements, voice of the customer, critical to quality, performance requirements, and then the starting point processes, these are all things that impact quality, or at least maybe help you understand quality, so you can then impact it. So if quality is the endpoint, and you see the arrows going from right to left, then how do we go about that? So the way I'm going to look at that today is it's going backwards. So if you want to develop the proper processes, which is the beginning point, we're going to map from quality one backwards. So we're going to start with understanding what quality is, and then we're going to map it backwards. And processes are really the last thing we're going to look at. Has anybody in here gone through a value stream mapping training or been engaged in value stream mapping? What's the first thing they teach you? You're going to map it backwards. So there's very good reasons for that. When you're creating a map that's going to be functional for identifying where the real issues are and also identifying solutions, if you can't identify the end game first, how do you know you're mapping the right things? So it's all a common theme with continuous improvement, but it works here very well also. Okay, so quality is customer driven. We said that. I'll kind of reinforce that because that's a big part of this. If quality is customer driven, then it's very important that we understand their wants and needs. So here's another quote that I like. So it's not about giving the customer what you think they need, but what they think they need. So it's very important. And some key words there, wants and needs. Do you understand both the wants and the needs? Some organizations are very good at understanding one or the other. So let's start with voice of the customer. Working backwards, that's our first block on the pathway. So voice of the customer, and this is probably some common terminology, but I'm going to present it a little bit of a different way with some of the techniques that we use. The voice of the customer as a business tool is the process of capturing a customer's expectations, preferences, and aversions. But it's also a market research tool that's used to really understand a detailed set of customers' wants and needs. And those two really are kind of one and the same. Different organizations might go about it a little bit differently. The voice of the customer studies will typically consist of both qualitative and quantitative. I think that's very important because I've been involved with organizations that have focused just on the qualitative and didn't bring in the data. So you want to have the quantitative data to go with the qualitative factors when you're trying to understand the voice of the customer. So here's some examples of ways you might go about collecting your voice of the customer data. Typically, they're very traditional market research methods. Direct customer interaction, that's really the interview process, talking to your customer, spending time with your customer and understanding them. Different types of surveys, focus groups. We've been involved in many of these, and they're very interesting. And I think if you focus just on one, you're going to miss some of the picture. If you can find a nice pathway to a good voice of the customer, try to bring in several of these. And I'll give you some examples later on some of the things that we do with this. Customer behavior and measurement. This is good as well. This is the data. This is the hard data that really impacts what the customer experience is. And this is the data that you can pull in from internal systems or external sources, of course. Social network, web browsers, everything that's been going on from the internet in the last 20 years has developed a whole new set of customer behavior and measurements that are available to you now. We used to go to different specific organizations we'd recognize to buy these things, but now Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, they're all getting more, in Google, getting more engaged in providing this kind of information. So don't get caught up in the box that you might be in when you think about where you get your market information. Think about where the potential for new types of market information are. People Twitter everything, they send tweets out. The hashtag's there for a reason. Someone's collecting trillions of pages of data that shows what people are talking about and what they're doing and what they're looking at. So that's part of your customer behavior, and that's very measurable as well. Okay, so wants and needs. And this is interesting because you really want to understand both the wants and the needs, because you may be providing a product that matches up with one or the other, or both, but you need to understand that. So customers typically have very preconceived notions of how a need might be met. So let me give you an example. So a parent wants to purchase Lucky Charms cereal for their children. What they really want, or what they really need rather, so I get confused myself sometimes, is a nutritious breakfast that is easy, fast to provide to their children. Those are kind of key words. So it's possible that a granola bar or a yogurt would do the trick, but they know the children want the cereal. That's what they like. So granola bar, even an apple, all those would be nutritious, they would be fast, they'd be quick, they'd be easy, they could eat it in the car on the way to school. So why do we go out and buy Lucky Charms for our kids? Besides, they have better TV commercials than apples. It's because that's what they want. That's what the kids want. So we have buying habits, and so customers will view the way they buy things, and then they'll view quality based on really different sets of circumstances that we might be overlooking. Okay, so we get engaged with several voice of the customer type projects with customers of ours. And typically we're a component of that. We'll partner up with market research companies that will do more the traditional fashion, but then we take the engineering approach to it, which I think is kind of neat. So we go in and conduct studies directly with customers and to understand their actual needs and their actual requirements. Typically, we'll understand more about the customers than the customers do, because we'll go out and watch the processes. We'll spend time with their people. We'll find out where the opportunities are, where the mistakes are made. We'll find out where things can be very impactful. We'll find out what their real requirements are. If it's a vendor we're working with, we'll find out more about their customers, because they just might be one piece of the supply chain. So we tend to learn a lot of things through direct observation and different data collection methods that allow us to really understand what those customers are looking for. We're focusing very much on what their goals are. What's the objectives and the goals for those customers? What are their processes? How are they going to use that product or service? Key things here is how would that product or service impact the customer? And how would that impact them in either a negative or positive way? Very important. Are there opportunities? And then key thing here also, the last thing I'll say on this slide is what is critical to quality? And we understand the voice of the customer, but that's going to transition us into understanding what are the critical points to quality as well. So our next step then is looking at critical to quality characteristics. So we're discussing voice of the customer, understanding what does the customer really want and need. But now let's kind of take that to the next step. Critical to quality are the key features by which customers evaluate the quality of your product or service. Determining what your critical qualities are is all about the conversion of the voice of the customer to measurable results, and that's a key thing. So we're taking a want and a need and we're turning it into something that's measurable. And we'll do that through critical quality. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing we want to do is we want to list out those wants or needs from our voice of the customer. And then we want to prioritize those. It's very important to focus on one at a time. So we'll just take one as an example and focus on that. So number two is that one need. So identify what that customer's need is. Number two is identifying the quality drivers. So these are the things that the customer sees. These are the things that really can impact quality in their eyes, the things that can be directly linked to their experience. And then number four, and this is more internal, define what your performance requirements are. So these are those metrics that you can tie back to quality. All right, I have a graphic here that will walk us through that will make this much easier to understand. But it's important to kind of get those points out there. All right, so we have a critical to quality tree. Now this critical to quality tree, it is a tool that actually walks us through those 5 steps that I just introduced to you. The critical quality tree is really used to help you visually see what those characteristics are and then tie them directly from the quality need all the way through the performance requirement. So here's an example. We focus on the customer need and then we look through to drivers and requirements. And it's a visual tool that I'll go directly into an example that I like. Okay, so let's look at this specific example. This example is around a customer service organization. So here on the far left is our starting point, and that's the customer's need. And this need we've identified here is good customer service. So these are just a sample. I think there would probably be more than 3 in this organization, but these are good ones to discuss. We look at our quality drivers. So what are some of the quality drivers that lead directly into good customer service? Well, one is waiting times. The second one here is a pleasant staff. And the third one here is the refund policy. Okay, so the point though is with the tree, and to get to with critical quality rather, is to get to our performance measurement. We want measurable results. So what are some of the measurable results for waiting time? Well, the first example here is 90% of customers satisfied with waiting time. The second one, all phone calls answered within 20 seconds. 90% of purchases and refunds processed within 2 minutes. So what we've done here is we've taken a specific need, identified a driver, and now we've put together a list of solid metrics that will tell us that if we're failing on any one of these 3 metrics, we're going to be failing here. And then it's organized by driver because it's easier to see and it's also easier to manage if you have to fix it later. Pleasant staff. All customers greeted within 30 seconds of entering the store. All customer-facing staff smile genuinely when interacting with customers. No fake smiles, you can tell. And then refund policy. 80% of customers satisfied with the refund policy. I think that's 80% because if they're refunding it, then there might be an underlying issue to begin with. So 100% might have been unattainable there. Okay, so this is a great tool. It's just a simple process map, a tree diagram that really allows you to draw a direct line between what the need is and then what are the metrics within our organization that we can follow, capture, we can communicate, and then we can take action items with as well. Okay, so let's talk about performance requirements. So what are the measurements that indicate performance? So we ended up on the critical quality tree with the list of performance requirements. So let's go into a little bit of a deeper dive on that as well. So the quote I'm going to share with you here is, if you don't know where you're going, you might end up somewhere else. Now, I don't know that I have a lesson for that. It's like Yogi Berra quotes, because they're always pretty funny. And they're well used. I'm sure you guys have heard this one before. Okay, so with measurable results then, how do we determine that? So how do you determine your performance measurements? And here's a list of some things that I think are very important, and we'll probably do a deeper dive on a few of these. You need to understand that your meaningful data comes from your voice of the customer. The voice of the customer is where it all starts. And that's where the critical quality tree started as well. And we're working backwards from the voice of the customer. Data must be obtainable and accessible. So that's important to think about. So even through voice of the customer, you may identify some metrics that make perfect sense. But what if those metrics, you can't pull them out of the systems very easily? What if the queries or the scripts or the survey results, what if this is information that's difficult to obtain or get on a reliable basis? Can you get a report in your email box every morning that tells you A? So those are things you have to consider when deciding what are our reasonable measurements to take. The data must be reliable. The data must be telling you what it thinks it's telling you. You know, if it is a survey, is it giving you the right responses that you'd expect? You're surveying people who just made a refund. So are they mad at your customer service representative on the phone, or are they just mad because the product didn't work? So make sure you're getting reliable data, and make sure you think about where the data is coming from and what it's really telling you. And be aware of averages and benchmarkings, which are things that happen internally within organizations quite a bit. Meaningful data, a little more discussion around the types of data we have. So we have hard data. So hard data is the quantitative things, pardon me, that you can take directly out of systems. So this typically are internal. These are the things that are quicker and easier to get, and you can respond to them in a more timely manner. So if I'm running off my system, back to my example about the wait times are something that's going to be in a phone system. That's data I can get very quickly. And then I can respond to it very quickly as well if there's ever an issue with that. Soft data, though, is typically collected after the fact, for example, through survey. It can be more subjective, you know, it could be more based on the customer's opinions, but also it may not be as timely as well. Now that doesn't mean that it's not meaningful. There's a lot of meaningful things you can do with hard and soft data. You just have to recognize the sources and what kind of data you're working with. So back to our example, this comes directly from that critical quality tree, and I've presenting here just the performance measurements. So 90% of customers satisfied with waiting time. That's soft data, because that's a satisfaction score from customers that we're getting through a survey. Calls answered within 20 seconds. 90% of purchases are refunded processed within 2 minutes. Those are hard data points that we're getting from our systems. The bottom one is another customer service one about the staff smiling. It's not less important, but we have to recognize where the data is coming from as well, since it's a soft data point. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about meaningful data. And this is something, this is actually a very accurate representation of a pie chart. So I don't think anybody can argue with me this is not the world's most accurate either. All right, just because you have data and it's available, is it really the data you need? This data is right, but would I be able to do much with this data? I might be able to judge how much more pie I have left. If I have a company coming over, I might know how much pie I get to serve my company. Maybe, I'm not saying all data is useless, but be mindful of where your data is. It's just a reminder to be mindful of that. Does that data match with the voice of the customer is telling you? Okay, here's some caveats as well. So beware of benchmarking. And then we, as a consulting firm, since we deal with a lot of different organizations, benchmarking is actually a very common question that we field. People ask us all the time, can you compare us against what other organizations are doing? Or can you provide us data? Tell us where we can find data. We really want to benchmark against our competitors. I mean, I think knowing your competitors is important. You don't want to ignore what your competitors are doing. And it could be some interesting lessons and maybe give you something to strive for as well. But when it comes to data itself, external benchmarking is not going to be very useful for you. Internal benchmarking is what you really want. Going back to that critical to quality tree, those are where your internal benchmarking points need to come from. You need to be tracking and following data points that tie directly back to quality, and that's quality that's being defined by your customer. And then use that as benchmarking to understand how you perform over time, what's your gaps, and analyze those gaps and look for corrective action. So that's the kind of benchmarking you want to focus on. Also, be aware of averages. Does anybody here ever use averages? They're easy to get out of spreadsheets. I actually use them quite a bit. But you want to be aware of them because averages can really hide a lot of your outliers. The averages is just that. It's the norm, it's the mean, it's the middle. So it's not really telling you what's happening with all the data points. So here's a good example of that. And nobody raised their hand about using averages, so I don't know if this is going to resonate with you or not. So we do a lot of work within laboratories as well. And this is an example of a Six Sigma project that we had done. And this was a laboratory test result that's coming from an emergency room department, so it has a pretty strict turnaround time. And what we're tracking here are turnaround time points for a laboratory test coming from the emergency room department in a hospital laboratory. The red line there is the turnaround time goal. So we would like to have all test results resulted and done within 25 minutes. So we tracked data points over a 24-hour period, and our data points actually came back with an average turnaround time of 21.5. Average turnaround times, these are very common metrics that laboratories use because there's limitations to their systems. And the systems are meant to manage results, not really to manage the operation. So you get a lot of averages. So this lab is performing well, they're succeeding. They're 3.5 minutes below the turnaround time goal, which means the emergency room should be very pleased with their results. But they're not. Because as you can see here visually, what are these points here? These are missed promises. So, and this data this is replicated data from an actual project. So we do have some outliers, and these outliers need to be addressed, but here's the cluster. Here's what really prompted us to start this process of analyzing the data to begin with. We had a process failure at a certain time of the day that had to be addressed. But if we were just running our business or running this laboratory specifically off averages alone, we're succeeding. We're 3.5 minutes better than what the customer, which is the emergency room department, is expecting. But this is what the customer sees. Every time this happens, there's a doctor and a patient waiting for a lab result. All right, here's another client example as well that of a client. This is in healthcare again, some things we did in the past. So one of our clients, they're a vendor for hospitals, and they had developed a new automated testing instrument for a laboratory. Their target customer was medium to large size hospitals, laboratories, which is really a common place for this type of automation. So they had a voice of the customer, and they understood that voice of the customer. And when you look at the target customer being medium to large hospitals, the instrument really met most of those needs. It hit the needs that the customers were expecting, but it also hit those in a cost-effective manner, which is anytime you introduce new systems, new technology, cost-effectiveness and return on investment is a big part of that. And that's part of the voice of the customer as well. So these things were all being met. However, what about other customer types? So laboratory testing doesn't happen just in hospitals. There's also reference environments. Reference laboratories are large commercial operations that test at high volumes. So contracts with these organizations can be very lucrative. Anybody in here in the healthcare industry? They're okay. So this is important. They were interested in reference environments as well. So they asked Argent if we would study the integration of these new instruments in those reference laboratory environments. You know, they've been very successful at hospital labs, but now they wanted to land contracts with the reference labs. So what we identified, though, is that the instrument was not well suited for these high volume testing environments. Some of the key things here is that the system really did not accommodate the sample arrival patterns or the capacity needs. The arrival patterns were that the specimens come in by courier, so they come in large batches, hundreds at a time, which isn't the case for a hospital lab. Hospital lab, they come in, you have some peaks in the morning draw period, but then the rest of it's just as things come in, either ambulatory clinics or the ER. The arrival patterns are very different than reference labs. So the problem here is that they have an incomplete voice of the customer. They didn't do a full voice of the customer to understand all their customer types. They had a primary customer, a target customer in mind, but they missed the boat on another lucrative customer because they didn't understand their full voice of the customers, if you really put it that way. All right, so that brings us to process, which is kind of it's the beginning point, but today it's our end point because we're working backwards. So everything has a process. I mean, everything that your company does as an organization has a process, whether it's written down or not. Some of those processes are good, and some need work. So some things that are important to know, though, is that just because you have a documented process doesn't necessarily mean that it assures quality. Be mindful that just because you have an SOP doesn't mean you have a best practice. SOPs are a good place to start. It should start to ensure better training and better standardization, but is it an efficient process? And is it a process that matches up with your voice of the customer? Processes that are inadequate will most likely negatively impact the customer experience. So that's why processes are the starting point when we look at quality. So how do you determine the right process? So do your processes deliver the results that are required to meet or exceed your customer expectations? I think that's not a surprise that I would say that, but that's important to reinforce that though as well. So the processes must be built to achieve your critical to quality factors. And that's why the map is built that way, where it goes directly from critical to quality to measurable results and then to processes. All right, so you remember this quote from a few slides ago. What I'm going to focus here though is that work on the causes of the results. Okay, the causes of the results. The processes are the causes of the results. If you don't have the results you were expecting, then your processes aren't providing those results. And that's what the cause is. Ensure that your processes deliver the performance requirements that your customers are expecting. All right, so let's talk about process evaluation. Value add. This is something that we use pretty frequently. This comes more specifically from the lean terminology of value add, and that is any activity that delivers or improves the product or service that the customer is expecting. So think voice of the customer. So some people say value add is anything the customer would be willing to pay for. So these are the things that meet the customer requirements. And the non-value add really is kind of the opposite of that. And that's any activity that does not deliver or improve the product or service or is not necessary. So one thing that we see when we analyze processes is that the largest majority of your defects or quality issues come out of the non-value added activities. There's a very strong correlation between the two. As you remove non-value added activities, you tend to remove points of defects or points of quality issues. In addition to that, and this maybe goes without being said, the non-value activities, these are the things that create inefficiencies and higher costs. So these are the ways, by addressing non-value added activities, you're going to improve quality, but you'll also be able to hopefully improve the overall performance and bottom line of your organization as well. All right, so let's work on the same example again from our customer service critical to quality tree. And let's look at how we can evaluate the process looking at one data point here. So 90% of purchases and refunds processed within 2 minutes. So we're measuring that and we're communicating those results. And what we've learned here is that only 68% are processed within 2 minutes, and then 14% are actually taking longer than 3 minutes. So there's a process failure there, which means that we should expect that there's a failure of quality in the customer's eyes as well. So let's evaluate that. So the processes are observed and the data was analyzed. And it was discovered that there were several issues on a second shift that resulted in longer processing times. But we had to go back to the processes to identify, and looking at the data as well, similar to my turnaround time example from the laboratory. We had to do both. And some of the things that were developed, or discovered rather, is that there were creep to the best methods, and this resulted in non-standard work, and some non-value-added steps had been introduced on second shift. Now this happens because most of management is on first shift. Or who trains people on second shift? Maybe the person's been around the longest. Who trains them? So there could be some quality issues you have when you have multiple shift operations. Also, something else that was discovered in this example, break schedules left gaps in both associate and supervisor coverage. So we had too few people working the phones, working the call center during specific times. And it didn't match up well with our best practices. So I draw this example because I want to tie specific examples of processes all the way back to good customer service. And sometimes simple solutions like this is really what's impactful to the overall experience of the customer. But you have to understand what's the line between the process back to what the customer considers quality. And that's what kind of the tree does, as well as the process map I've introduced to you, is drawing that line between the two. Okay, so continuous improvement. This is kind of the next step to discussions and processes. So if your processes are stable, or if they're becoming stable, you still need to strive for continual improvement. So if you have best practices in place and you're satisfied with your customer service, or pardon me, if you're satisfied with your quality and your reasonable measurements, you don't want to stop. You want to keep continuing evaluating. This goes back to kind of some lean philosophies about continuous improvement. So opportunities always present themselves. If you're not looking at continuous improvement, you do run the risk of that creep, and best practices can creep. Individuals will introduce non-value activities over time, so you have to reevaluate where your processes are, and it's very important. It's also good to think about when you're going after changing your processes as an initiative and not a program. A lot of organizations will say, okay, we have a new program, they put signs on the walls or on the bulletin boards. The problem with that is programs are expected to come to an end. And associates may say, well, I'll be glad when this program ends. And so you want to say this is an initiative. And with an initiative, it's more of a culture change. And that goes back into some Lean and Six Sigma philosophies as well, but I think that's very important when you're thinking about the way processes change. All right, so in summary, we've walked through this process map for how you arrive at quality. And if you remember, the end point where we started is quality, and the quality is defined by the customer, of course. And we walk back through how to draw a line directly to processes, which is really kind of the beginning point within your organization. All right, thank you. I really wanted to open up for questions, but I've been told that I have to.
Okay, so questions for Steve?
I couldn't know. Yes.
Do you use tools like quality function deployment? Quality function deployment as you're going through documenting your critical qualities and
We have customers that use that. He asked the question was, do you use tools like quality functional deployment? And I know that's a methodology for documentation. That's some of our customers that are engaged in Six Sigma use those tools. And I think as engineers, we probably follow the same path. We have different names for it. And so it's not unusual for us to work closely with our customers on internal projects like that, where we complement and provide information so they can develop their own documentation.
The comment on benchmarking was interesting. So you would say, hey, don't benchmark against other folks. Just compare that against what you come up with in your critical quality measures.
Yes.
So you're talking about benchmarking as a comparative measure, not necessarily benchmarking in best practice or something like that. It may lead to improvement in it.
I would say that you want to know where your competitors stand. If your competitors are delivering a promise that your customers are expecting, one, that will come through voice of the customer. So your competitor's benchmark will be turned into your voice of the customer if that's what your customers want. If it doesn't resonate well with your customers, then it's not going to really be a valid benchmark for you. So I'm not saying ignore what your customers or competitors are doing, but if you're really trying to look for root causes, like how can we really impact quality of our organization, or impact service levels, or impact cost or profitability, the only benchmarking that's going to work well for you is the internal benchmarking. So it's about context and how you use it. But at the end of the day, the internal is going to be much more valuable. Any more?